So this is going to be a pretty long-winded video, but I really want to discuss the differences between all of Sony's mirrorless cameras right now in the consumer market, because there's so many out there and the line's a little bit blurred. People don't know who these cameras are actually for, what they're actually best used for, and hopefully this video will help you guys in making a decision if you're actually going to be upgrading or just getting a B camera, or if you're literally just first timers, which camera do you actually get? What's going on, my friends? I hope you're all doing fantastic. If you are new to my channel, please consider subscribing and obviously giving me a thumbs up. So first of all, we got to talk about the ZV line, and the ZV-1 Mark II is the newest in the ZV range when it comes to the smaller cameras. Now this has a 21 megapixel type 1 sensor, so it is a pretty small sensor, but it still has some pretty incredible capabilities. Now you can actually record up to 4K 30 frames per second and 1080p at 120 frames per second with 8-bit 420. Now this camera has a focal length of about 18 to 50 when it comes to full frame equivalent, and it is a variable aperture of f1.8 to an f4. Now it has one SD card slot, a micro HDMI, has a 3-inch flip screen, which is pretty good because you'll be able to articulate it so it can face you and you can actually see your framing and composition while you're filming yourself. Now it has the multi-interface hot shoe, which you're able to utilize all Sony's microphones, which pretty much powers directly into that multi-interface hot shoe, and you don't actually have any cords, and it automatically turns on by itself depending on which device you actually utilize. Now it does have a 1/8 ND filter, so if you want to try and keep that motion blur quite nice, utilizing that ND filter is actually very handy. Now it actually has the USB-C slot for streaming, which is fantastic because it powers directly into that, but you can actually stream with it. You can use it for a webcam. If you are a gamer, it's pretty cool. It's just a really good feature to have. And I think one of the biggest advantages is that it is a really small body. So it's only 266 grams, obviously without the battery and SD card. So it's a very, very small body. You don't actually have to change lenses. The lens focal length is already within the camera. It's a brilliant point and shoot camera, a very good option for people who just want to travel, for vloggers, for basic streamers, potentially basic YouTubers, maybe even some photographers as well. So it is still a fairly decent camera and a little bit of a bump up from actually having, just your smartphone. Now the next one is kind of like a sidestep, and that's the ZV-1F. Essentially it was just a standard one focal length, but it does actually have a few downgrades. Now it does have that same 21 megapixel one type sensor, and you can pretty much get 4K 30 frames per second and 1080p at 120 frames per second as well, but it only has contrast detection autofocus, so the autofocus isn't as reliable as pretty much all the other Sony cameras. Now there is actually a prime lens on there, which is just a 20mm focal length at an f2.0, so you can't actually zoom in or zoom out. You would have to do digital zooming obviously in post, or you can actually do digital zoom with clear image zoom in camera. Now this camera is even smaller with a body design of 229 grams, so it's not significantly smaller than the ZV-1 Mark II, but it is small enough where you can literally just fit it in your pocket and just travel around with it, or just have it as a webcam. So look, overall these smaller ZV point and shoot cameras are very basic. They just get people from, instead of using their smartphones, to obviously using just a camera where they have an SD card and you can start going through that workflow. Someone who just needs a small travel camera to throw in their pocket or backpack and just not having to pull out their smartphone all the time and keep the devices separate. Now the next one I've made a few videos on, and that is the brand new ZV-E10 Mark II. Now this camera is a fantastic camera specifically because of that sensor. It's got a 26 megapixel BSI CMOS sensor. It has the ability to do up to 4K 60 frames per second with 10-bit 422 codec. So the overall image that you're actually going to be getting out of this camera is going to be absolutely phenomenal. Now it doesn't have in-body image stabilization, but it does have active stability, which is digital stabilization, which is done in camera, but you can also do stabilization in post-production as well. Now it's got a newer 3-inch flip screen. It's got the newer Sony menu. It also has the FZ100 battery, which is fantastic because you'll be able to utilize this camera for far longer than those really small batteries that Sony used to have. Now it's also got just an SD card slot, a micro HDMI slot, a USB-C. It's also got the same multi-interface hot shoe on the top. And the one interesting feature that isn't in any other Sony camera is that it can actually flip the user interface. So if you do actually like using vertical shooting, it's going to flip all the details into vertical shooting. So it just makes it easier to read, which is a really cool feature to have. Now this is the first one in the line that we're going to be talking about that has Sony's E-mount. Now E-mount actually gives you all the E-mount mount lenses that you can attach directly to this. So you don't have to just stick to one focal length like the point and shoot ZV cameras. You can actually change out a whole bunch of Sony lenses or third-party lenses directly on here, which gives you so much more options and a larger room to be creative. Now, if you do want to see a full review of all these cameras, they are on my channel. So all you need to do is go for a search within my channel. Now, the ZV-E10 Mark II is a very significant step up when it comes to comparing it to the point and shoot cameras. It's got a larger sensor size, it's got better image quality, better high frame rates, and overall it's just more of a robust, bigger design. And this is definitely going to be great for YouTubers, vloggers, content creators, travel photographers, even just people starting out. It's a fantastic camera to start out because it is the lowest when it comes to pricing in their ZV range with that APS-C size sensor. Now, the next one is a pretty significant step up from the ZV-E10 Mark II, and that is the ZV-E1. Now, this is the full frame sensor that you will see in higher Sony mirrorless cameras. It's a 12 megapixel sensor. It is a large full frame, low light beast. Now, this has incredible sensitivity and fantastic for vloggers. Now, it has the ability to do up to 4K at 120 frames per second with 10-bit 422, so the image quality is going to be absolutely phenomenal. Now, it also does have in-body image stabilization, but also dynamic active stability, which is Sony's premium stability feature that is in these newer Sony cameras. So if you are going to be walking and talking or holding the camera nice and steady, it's really going to keep the camera super steady in a lot of different situations. Now, it also has that 3-inch flip screen, the FZ100 battery, that 1 card slot, the micro HDMI, the USB-C, the multi-interface. You can actually utilize all Sony's microphones. And it also has Sony's E-mount, so you have a plethora of lenses to choose from. Now, if you do want to actually check out a full review of the ZV-E1, I've got multiple videos on this channel. But this camera is definitely suited towards YouTubers, content creators, vloggers, travel videographers, even professional videographers. This could be a fantastic A camera, but also an incredible B camera in your kit. Now, it is the most priciest camera in the ZV range, but it definitely is hitting the higher end of the ZV range, mainly because of that incredible sensor that it actually has in the body. Now, we've got to talk about the A6000 range. Now, this range is absolutely fantastic for beginners, intermediates, and also professionals. This camera is the A6700. This actually has the same sensor that's in the ZV-E10 Mark II, the 26 megapixel BSI CMOS sensor, but this gives you the ability to do 4K up to 60 frames per second, but then you have 4K 120 frames per second with a 1.5 times crop, and you actually have 10-bit 422 as well. Now, this definitely is a step up from the ZV-E10 Mark II because it also has that flip screen, but it's also got an EVF as well. So if you do like doing photography, utilizing the EVF, this is going to be great. Even if you just have really bright situations where you can't see the back of the screen, having that EVF and putting it up to your eye is just going to be such a fantastic feature to actually have. Now, you are actually able to capture 26 megapixel stills with 11 frames per second in burst mode. So if you do a little bit of sports photography or wildlife, this is still going to be a fantastic camera to utilize. Now, same as the other cameras, it's got the Z100 battery, it's got 1 card slot, it's got a micro HDMI, a USB-C port, the same multi-interface hot shoe, and it also has the Sony E-mount. Now, this camera, like I said, is fantastic for videographers, professional, intermediate, or even beginners. Great for photographers, same thing, professional, intermediate, or beginners, travel videographers, or content creators. This camera is actually a really good hybrid camera that can do photos really well, but also videos really well, so it can suit a larger demographic. And especially for the price, you're getting incredible value out of this camera. Now, we've got to talk about the A7 series cameras, which is Sony's premium full frame set of cameras. And first, let's talk about my most used camera, the A7 IV. Now, this has the newer 33 megapixel BSI CMOS sensor, which gives us 4K at 30 frames per second and 4K 60 with a 1.5 times crop. Now, you can actually do 1080p at 120 frames per second with 10-bit 422 as well. Now, this gives you 33 megapixel stills up to 10 frames per second with electronic shutter and about 6 frames per second with the mechanical shutter. It also has a 3-inch flip screen, but it does actually have a better EVF of 3.69 million dots. Now, it's also got IBIS inside, so you're going to get some nice stable shots, and it does have active stability on top, which is just a small crop with digital stabilization. Now, with most of Sony's newer full frame cameras in the A7 line, this is where you're going to get the larger full-size HDMI. So this is going to be great for building it out and utilizing camera monitors on top. This also has the newer technology where you have 2 card slots, but one of them is actually the newer Type A cards. Now, newer Type A cards, they're faster, they're more durable, but they are very expensive, but they definitely do last much longer than SD cards. Now, this camera is very similar to the A6700 where it applies to a large demographic. Definitely a fantastic hybrid camera, which pretty much means it does photos great, does videos great. It can suit beginners, intermediate, and professionals as an A cam or a B cam. Now, there are pros and cons with these cameras, but if you do want to see individual reviews, obviously, like I said, just click on my channel and search for Sony A7 IV. Now, the A7C Mark II is pretty much an A7 IV, but just in a smaller, different body. It has that same 33 megapixel sensor, and it also still has the ability to do 4K 30 and 4K 60 with a 1.5 times crop. It's got the 10-bit 422s, so you're pretty much getting identical image quality as the A7 IV in this A7C Mark II. It's got the flip screen, but it's got a smaller 2.36 million dot EVF. Now, the one downside about being a smaller body, it's only got 1 card slot, and it's just an SD card. It doesn't actually have a Type A card slot, and it's also micro HDMI and not the full-size HDMI that you see in the other A7 cameras. So all up, if you are looking for something just a little bit smaller, a little bit more compact, the A7 series is a great range. And just like the A7 IV, it's a great hybrid camera. It's great for photography, videography, for professional or intermediate or beginner use, but it does seem like it lacks because of that full-size HDMI that it lacks, the 1 card slot. It's probably not as reliable as it's going to be with the A7 IV, but still going to be an incredible purchase. Now, the A7C-R is a pretty interesting camera. The R stands for resolution. Now, this takes the sensor out of the A7R5 model, which is Sony's really high resolution photography / videography camera. It has the newer 61 megapixel sensor that actually has the ability to record 8K internal, but it doesn't shoot 8K. That is actually reserved for the A7R5, but it still can do 4K up to 30 frames per second full frame and 4K 60 with a 1.2 times crop. Now, it pretty much is the same body size as the A7C Mark II, just with that higher resolution sensor. It has very similar features with IBIS and active stability. It's got your 1 SD card slot, your micro HDMI, same flip screen, same EVF, same battery. It's a very similar design. Just think they've got a different high resolution sensor inside that small body. So this pretty much means it's going to be fantastic for landscape or architecture photographers, street photography, and even some basic videography as well. Because the image quality is absolutely phenomenal in this, you're going to get incredible hybrid use out of this. So if you are someone that really needs to take advantage of a higher megapixel camera at a slightly lower cost than the Alpha 7 R5 range, then this camera might actually be for you. Now, this is a brilliant segue. We do have to talk about the A7R range. Now, the A7R5 is Sony's newest camera in the R range. Now, it has that same 61 megapixel sensor that's in the A7C-R, but this camera actually gives you the ability to record 8K up to 30 frames per second with 420 10-bit. You can actually do the same 4K 30 or 4K 60 with a 1.2 times crop, 1080p at 120 frames per second, or with 10-bit 422. Now, because it is a higher resolution sensor, you can only get about 8 megapixel stills when it comes to high burst rate, but still, you're going to get incredible images out of this thing. You can actually do image stacking as well, which gives you an incredibly large file, but the resolution on this thing is phenomenal. Now, you actually do get 7 stops of IBIS inside this body, so the IBIS is actually much better than some of the other Alpha cameras, but you also do have that active stability on top as well. Now, in this A7R5, you get the newest, really amazing flip screen, which is a 4-axis flip screen. It pretty much flips up, but it also flips out and faces towards you, so it pretty much pleases absolutely everyone. And this is a screen that I'd love to see in all Sony mirrorless cameras. Now, the great thing about this camera, it's more of a professional camera. So you're actually going to get 2 SD card slots, with both of them actually being Type A slots as well, which is pretty incredible if you actually do redundancy recording or simultaneous recording. Now, this is also the camera that actually has a large HDMI as well. So it's really going to be good for video recording, but also professional photography. So you're going to get far more use out of this camera when it comes to the higher end professional realm than you will with the smaller cameras. But I guess when you think about it, it is at a higher price. It's more of a premium cost, but this is actually one of the higher end Sony cameras that you can get for definitely professional users. Now the A7S range is Sony's sensitivity range. You do have the A7S III, which pretty much when it dropped, it was an incredible camera, and it still is to this day. It's got a 12 megapixel BSI CMOS sensor, has the ability to do ISO 800 to 12,800, and both of the images will look almost identical when it comes to noise performance. Now it has a 9.44 million dot EVF, which was the first of its kind in the Sony Alpha range, and it's incredibly nice to use. Even though it's more of a photography feature, there still are some videographers that would take advantage of this. Now it has full-size HDMI, it's got the dual card slot with both of them having Type A cards, and it's got that ability to do 4K at 120 frames per second with 10-bit 422 codec, and you can actually do 1080p at 240 frames per second in slow and quick mode. Now this camera is specifically designed predominantly for videographers. Because of the lower megapixel sensor, it's probably not going to be great for photographers that need some, nice high resolution photos, but there are some circumstances where the A7S III is still going to be perfectly fine for photography. You just will miss out on some of that resolution. But when it comes to videography, this camera is probably one of the best to get in the Alpha range. Great low light sensitivity, great high frame rates, and just overall incredible image quality. Now the Alpha 1 is pretty much meant to be Sony's flagship range. This actually has a stacked 50 megapixel sensor, which gives you incredibly fast readout, gives you up to 30 frames per second when it comes to stills in electronic shutter, and about 20 frames per second with mechanical shutter. Now it's got the incredible 9.44 million dot EVF that you see in the Sony A7S III and the A7R5. You can actually do up to 4K at 120 frames per second with just a 10% crop on top, and you can do 8K at 30 frames per second as well, which is pretty incredible out of this camera. One of the great things about it being a really fast sensor is that it has a really fast shutter. You can actually get up to 1/32,000th of a second when it comes to that shutter speed, which is pretty incredible. Now it does have IBIS, but it only has 5.5 stops of IBIS, but you still have active stability on top, which is still going to be great for most use cases. Now it does have an older screen on this as well. It only flips up, it doesn't actually flip out, whereas the A7R5, you do have that fully articulating 4-axis screen, which also flips up but flips out as well. So maybe the A1 Mark II, we might actually see that newer generation of screens. Now being a professional camera, it does have a dual SD card slot, but also a dual Type A card slot. Same again, it's great for redundancy or simultaneous recording. Now the Alpha 1 being the flagship camera, it's going to be great for pretty much anyone who wants to be, in that professional line. Brilliant for professional photographers, great for professional videographers. It does have some limitations depending on obviously what you do when it comes to being in video, but it's still going to give you incredible looking images and video recording, and having 8K internal could actually be very beneficial for videographers needing that really premium feature. Now the Alpha 1 is starting to see a little bit of age when it comes to some of these newer Sony Alpha cameras, coming in with a lot of features that this Alpha 1 doesn't actually have. But like I said, the Alpha 1 Mark II is really going to top this one and have some incredible features. But if you do have that premium budget, this camera is going to be one of the best that you can actually get in the Alpha range. Now the Sony A9 is an incredible range. It used to be the low megapixel, really high frame rate camera, but they've done something pretty interesting this time, as they've added the A9 III, which is a 24 megapixel global shutter sensor. Now it's the first of its kind when it comes to mirrorless cameras in this size. And global shutter sensor essentially just means that it has an incredible readout where it reads the whole sensor at once, rather than a standard rolling shutter sensor that we get in all the Sony cameras, is that it reads from line to line from top to bottom. So you start to see rolling shutter artifacts, but this one, zero rolling shutter artifacts. Now they've actually stacked this camera with a whole bunch of new features. With that 9.44 million dot EVF, you've got the new flip screen, 4-axis flip screen that you see in the A7R5. You've got the ability to do 4K 60 frames per second, which is actually oversampled from 6K. You've got 4K 120 frames per second, which is actually pixel bin, but still incredible for 10-bit 422 codec. But it does have a small disadvantage, with the base ISO being ISO 2000 in S-Log 3, which is far higher than the normal 800. And this is where things get really interesting with stills, is that you have the ability to do 120 frames per second in stills with raw output. That is absolutely incredibly fast, but a lot of people probably don't need that, but it can be insane for wildlife photographers, sports photographers, anyone who just needs to freeze the frame right there and then. But one of the great things about it being a very high sports photography camera is it actually has 1 second pre-roll. So essentially, once you hit that shutter button, it can actually take the stills from 1 second before you've actually hit that record button. Now, paired with that global shutter sensor and fast readout, you can actually do 1/80,000th of a second when it comes to that shutter speed. So you can really freeze the frame, which is insane. And your flash sync is going to be faster. If you do a lot of flash photography, this is going to be your camera to get. Now, same again, it's got the full-size HDMI, the Z100 battery, it's got a dual card slot with the SD card and Type A cards, and it's also got that nice Sony E-mount with a whole bunch of lenses to choose from. Now, the IBIS is actually upgraded in this, which gives you 8 stops of in-body image stabilization, and it's got dynamic active stability on top as well, which is just in the ZV-E1, which I absolutely love and is incredibly steady. Now, in my opinion, this is very similar to the A1. It is a little bit cheaper than the A1. Sure, it doesn't have a larger 50 megapixel sensor. It's only got 24 megapixels, so you don't have as much resolution, but that global shutter sensor gives you so much capabilities, and it can be very specific to sports and really high frame rate shooting. So once again, this could be great for wildlife photography, sports and action photography, and it can be a great videography camera as well. You do just have to look at the limitations of that higher ISO sensor, which could potentially give you a little bit more noise in your image, but you do actually have to take that into consideration with what kind of work you actually do. Okay, now we're going to be talking about Sony's Cine line cameras. Now, first of all, we're going to talk about the FX30. Now, the FX30's body was pretty much designed directly off the Sony FX3, which was released a little bit before this camera. Now, the FX30 has that same sensor that you see in the A6700 and the ZV-E10 Mark II, but it pretty much came first in this camera. Now, just like the A6700, it can do 4K up to 60 frames per second and 4K 120 frames per second with a 1.5 times crop, but this can actually do 240 frames per second in 1080p with 10-bit 422. Now, one of the biggest design differences of this FX line camera is essentially that it's more a boxy design. It doesn't have an EVF, it's just got that flip screen, but it has an inbuilt fan, which gives it a little bit more reliability when it comes to professional video use and just not having the ability to overheat. The whole body design is pretty much optimized for video. It really just depends on how you actually like to operate this camera, but I absolutely love the look and feel of this actual design. Now, the minor differences that you'll see in this camera to some of the other Alpha cameras is that this has the dual Type A card slot or dual SD card slot as well. And one of the great features about the design as well, it does have external tally lights. So it has a big red LED on the front, the back, and obviously the screen as well to let you know that you're actually recording. When it comes to the recording frame rates, you can actually do DCI 4K recording in this as well. Now, it actually has a couple of firmware features that you don't actually see in some of the Alpha cameras, and that's internal de-squeeze when it comes to monitoring for anamorphic lenses. Now, at the time of this recording, it doesn't actually have shutter angle, but there is a future update that's actually going to be coming that will give this shutter angle, because it's kind of stuck with the shutter speed, which is more of a photography based term. Shutter angle you'll see in general filmmaking cameras. Now, there are some Sony Alpha cameras that actually allow for this, but through this HDMI, you can actually externally record 16-bit RAW through the Atomos Ninja 5, but it actually does make that 16-bit RAW file more of a 12-bit RAW file, because that's the maximum that the Atomos Ninja 5 can actually output. Now, you can actually buy the body itself, or you can buy the version where it actually has the top handle, which has 2 XLR and 1 3.5 audio jack directly in, which gives you a little bit more professional audio controls. Now, even though this is a video camera, it actually does have very slight photography features. You can actually take one single frame still at 26 megapixels, but it is only electronic shutter as well. But still, you can actually get a little bit of photography out of this, but it's predominantly for video shooters. So if you are a filmmaker, when it comes to narrative filmmaking, YouTube work, content creation, this camera is probably for you. Now, overall, the price for this one isn't much more than the A6700, and it sort of is justified because it actually does add a little bit more features than what you will see in the Sony Alpha cameras. Now the next one we have to talk about is pretty much the FX3. Now this came out with the newer body first, and then the FX30 actually adopted that newer body. But the FX3 actually sports that same sensor that you find in the A7S III. Essentially, it's the same camera, just built different with a little bit of different internals. Now it's pretty much identical when it comes to the A7S III specs, and very similar to the FX30 when it comes to anamorphic D-squeeze, DCI 4K, 16-bit RAW external, and it also will have that shutter angle in the future firmware update. Now overall, this is one of the best bang for your buck cameras that you can get when it comes to high-end video professional work. This was actually used in a very high-end professional film, The Creator. I'm pretty sure everyone knows about that, but this can be used in so many different situations with commercial work, just basic YouTube stuff, documentary filmmaking, narrative films, short films. There's a whole bunch of different applications that you can actually have with this camera. Now it is actually in the mid to high end sort of Sony pricing, but when you actually think about the specs you actually get out of this and the value you're getting, it is an extremely phenomenal camera. Now the next camera we actually have to talk about is my absolute workhorse, and that is the Sony FX6. Now this is pretty much based off the Sony FS5, which was an APS-C size sensor, but this actually has the same sensor that's in the A7S III and FX3, which is that 12 megapixel BSI CMOS sensor, which is incredible for low light situations, extremely fast rolling shutter, and just overall a brilliant performing sensor. Now, as you can see, the actual design is more of a broadcast / cinema style body. It has a HDMI out, SDI out, it's got time code, it uses the larger BPU batteries, it's got a side handle, it's got a top handle with 2 XLR inputs, it's got the rotating screen as well. And one of my favorite features, it's got the internal variable ND filter. And unfortunately with this body, they've taken out the IBIS and they don't have digital stabilization. Now overall, this is an absolute workhorse, great for commercials, documentaries, corporates, you could even do weddings, short films, and even YouTube work. So there is a large variety of actual use cases for this camera. And it's even small and light enough that you could actually throw it on a gimbal as well. Now, one of the great things about being a more of a higher end in the cinema line, it does have some better features when it comes to waveform. You can also have shutter angle as well, and a couple of other features that you will see in the Sony FX6, FX9, the Venice, and the Burano cameras. Now overall, this camera is on the higher ends, but obviously with the specs that you actually get out of it, you get some incredible value for a fairly decently priced body. It does show a little bit age, so the FX6 Mark II might actually come out and fix some of the issues that the FX6 has, but if you buy the FX6 in 2024, you're still going to get an incredible camera. Now the next one we have to talk about is the Sony FX9. Now I've only used it a couple of times, so I don't really have too much footage to actually go by this, but it's a pretty incredible camera, but it is slightly dated because when it did come out 6 months later, the FX6 came out and had some pretty impressive features that the FX9 didn't even have. But the FX9 actually has a higher 20 megapixel sensor. It's a 6K sensor that downsamples to 4K, so it's high resolution. You can get up to 4K 60, but you can do 4K 120 if you externally record. Now it is a larger body, sort of designed off the Sony FS7, and it's a very similar broadcast sort of style camera, but it has some pretty good Super 35 features as well, which is brilliant for broadcast and documentary filmmakers. Now this camera is in the highest price of the cinema line, and it definitely is sort of that premium budget, but if you are doing some really high-end professional commercial work, corporate work, wedding films, documentary stuff, this camera definitely is for you. Now look, we won't talk about the Cine Alta cameras because that actually has the Sony Burano. It's got the Venice 1 and Venice 2. They are a completely different workhorse, really high-end cameras. And if you're watching a YouTube video like this, you're probably not going to be, looking at some overall specs. You're going to be diving deep into the individual cameras there. But they are Sony's higher-end cinema cameras that you'll see in really high-end documentaries and definitely feature films as well. So anyway, my friends, like I said, if you do want to see individual videos of these cameras, I do have a whole bunch on this channel, so just give it a search and you'll most likely find something that you'll actually need and find useful with those particular cameras. But I just wanted to give it a bit of an overall general view of cameras that you would consider in the Sony range. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.